The Glow by Brooke Stanwood. Copyright 1979 by Brooke Stanwood. Before. I have immortal longings in me. Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. Vinnie Romano carefully tucked his pint of Fleischmann's into the barrel of leaves, then stuck his heavy bristle broom in on top of it, handle first, and whistling what he thought was an aria, started toward his next section. He had been with the Parks Department for 12 years, after 7 in sanitation. His first 4 years in a small park in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn had been a drag. No one to talk to. Hard to goof off. But since then he had been in Central Park and he loved it. Always action. Even with the cuts and layoffs. Thank God for his seniority. There was still not much to do and lots to look at. As he neared the reservoir, he stopped to watch 2 young kids neck with a passion that was almost frightening. They couldn't have been more than 16, and the boy almost had her sweater off. Vinnie didn't linger long, for he had seen more and better before. Whistling on, he passed the huge black man with the diamond front tooth who dealt grass, coke, and uppers to the kids from some of those fancy private schools. It was still too early for the man's business, and he lounged on the park bench reading a copy of Hustler. A well-tailored young woman on a dove-gray horse cantered by, followed by an older man on a large bay. They both could ride. Vinnie couldn't keep count of how many people he had had to call ambulances for who had taken falls, some very bad. He told his wife, Angie, "Better to bet them than ride them. The fuckers are too high off the ground." And then he saw them, his favorites. Of all the weird, dippy, bizarre people in the park, his favorites were the pacemaker pacers. He had named them himself and was proud of the tag. They ran every day, and all wore matching powder blue jogging suits. Their number fluctuated. Sometimes there were as many as 8, but never fewer than 3. There were 4 men and 4 women, and not one of them was under 55. Vinnie leaned against his broom as they glided by. It was probably their second lap, and they hadn't broken into a sweat. And that was with each lap at slightly under 1.6 miles. They really looked good today. Their skin glowed with a healthy flush, and they ran with a sprightly bounce. As they moved away from him, mushroom puffs of dry cinders kicked up by their Adidas running shoes hung for a moment in their wake. With legs pumping high and smooth, they disappeared around the bend. Part 1. Chapter 1. March. If you can't put them on without pain, dear, the effect just won't be there. Jackie Lawrence gritted her teeth as the 2 salesmen, Darby and Sid, pulled and jammed her tiny figure into a pair of even tinier French jeans. She had read about the shop in Women's Wear Daily, the Bible, which was delivered daily to her office at Henri Bendel. Everyone thought her figure looked great, except Pete, who always found her pants baggy. So here she was at Le Derrière Monde with 2 muscular but sweet and totally safe salesmen wrestling her into a pair of jeans that Tatum O'Neil would have had to reduce to get into. "Positively Grecian," said Sid, as he stepped back to assess the image. "I'm having trouble breathing." "It's a small price to pay, dear," said Darby. "Positively sculpted," said Sid, now a few steps further back. She had to admit that she noticed heads turning as she walked up Madison towards 79th to catch the crosstown bus. Pete once asked Jackie what 3 presents she would like most in the world if they suddenly became rich. She didn't remember if the first was a super house in the Berkshires or a designer collection every year for the rest of her life. But she knew that the third was definitely an eternal low number at the cold cuts counter at Zabar's. This flashed through Jackie's mind as she waded into the crowd in Zabar's, the last stop on her way home. Zabar's was to the New York food freak what the Sandoz experimental drug lab was to an addict. Above the babble of voices and cash registers and slicing machines came a mistral aroma of cheeses, spices, coffees, charcuterie of bewildering ethnicity, and cold fish of every kind from Scottish salmon to kippered whitefish. She inhaled deeply and slid her newly contoured self into the cold cuts department, where she grabbed a ticket. 94. They were only up to customer 79, so Jackie struggled to the back of the store for a jar of Cornichons and a pound of freshly ground coffee. By the time she made it back to cold cuts, they had just hit the 90s. Number 90 was a Zaftig lady with an inordinate fondness for American Indian jewelry. "Sir," said the woman, "I'm buying Westphalian ham, not paper." She pointed an accusatory finger at the counterman. "Please don't put paper between each slice. Use it to line your parakeet's cage." "Lady, this is wax paper, not tar paper. It doesn't weigh a thing." "I'd like to hear you say that to Betty Furness." "Lady, I'd say it to Sadat." The West Side, Jackie smiled. It did have its moments. Jackie's good humor faded as she entered their apartment. When they'd moved in 2 years ago, shortly before they were married, they'd been pleased. The bedroom was small, the kitchen even smaller, but the living room had potential. And it was cheap. They gave everything 2 coats of white paint. A paint chip of geological thickness revealed that some fool had painted the kitchen black once, and the black still crept through in spots. The line being given out then by the decorating honchos was that all it took was $1,000 and a little imagination to create a stylish-looking apartment from scratch. What they hadn't said was that to pull it off you had to have either the instincts of a Billy Baldwin or a great space to work with. And what they hadn't had in mind was what real estate people called a junior 3, and one with all the lightness and airiness of a cave. In recent months, Jackie's disappointment had escalated to dissatisfaction, then dislike, and now loathing. The sooner they checked out of here, the happier she would be. When Jackie heard Pete's key in the lock, she had almost finished frying eggplant for a spaghetti sauce as feisty as her temper. The air was dense with smoke. She eased the last 2 pieces into the skillet as he came into the kitchen. Pete was a shade under 6 feet, but gave the impression of being taller because he stood so straight. He had lively brown eyes that seemed darker under a head of tight black curls. "I bet I can guess what we're having for dinner," he said, sniffing the air. "I think folks in the village know, too." "You loved this dish the last time I made it," said Jackie quickly. "Hey, take it easy," Pete said, hugging her. "Now kiss me before I crack your spine and send the remains to Paul Bocuse." Jackie tilted her head up and smiled. Pete always could get to her. Thank God! She had blonde hair, gray-blue eyes, and classic features that had been the envy of her friends at school as soon as they were old enough to realize that some girls are prettier than others. At age 13, she had worried obsessively that she'd be short when she grew up. She turned out to barely top 5 feet, but everything else checked out fine. Now she reached up and ran her fingers through Pete's wiry hair and pulled his head toward her. "You taste great," Pete said. "How about skipping dinner?" "How about postponing it? I've already invested a half hour in it." "My time and motion expert," he said, laughing. "At least come sit down. We can just catch the 7 o'clock news." Jackie pulled the cooked eggplant from the pan and called after Pete as he headed for the living room. "Anything happen in the great world of publishing today?" "Not much, aside from having my mind blown and being very depressed all day." What are you talking about? Well, I stopped at the candy store downstairs and picked up the Times, as usual. Then I went down to wait for the train, which was late, as usual. Anyway, I started to look through the paper, and when I got to the obit page, damn it if Sheldon Haber's face didn't jump out at me. Who's he? You remember. You met him at the Doubleday party at ABA in San Francisco. The guy who thought you had great legs. Oh, the small round man who was guzzling those martinis? Right. Probably the best editor of serious fiction around. Dead. At the new school. 5 minutes into a question and answer period after delivering a lecture on Pynchon and the new wasp imagination. Just keeled over. 39. That's terrible. Yeah. I had lunch with him last week at the Italian Pavilion. They knew him better there than they knew the owner. He had 3 dry Bombay martinis, tortellini in brodo, a bowl, not a cup, vitello tonnato, and with a side order of creamed spinach, and then some rum cake with a snifter of Remy Martin. He did that 5 days a week, only sometimes the food was French. The most strenuous exercise he ever had was carrying bound galleys home in his attaché case. It sounds like nobody pushed him. You're right, and it got me thinking about myself. And you, too. Maybe it's being 30. I don't mind getting older, but I don't want to deteriorate. You've been to too many Bergman movies. What I mean, babes, is that the better we take care of ourselves, the better everything else will be. Sheldon was an extreme case, but we drink too much too. And we like good, meaning rich, food. He took hold of her shoulders and turned her toward him. You're beautiful. And I'm not half bad myself. But I want us to stay this way. I'm out of shape, and I don't like it. I could go on, but the bottom line is we have to watch ourselves. And exercise. Good idea. I've got a copy of that Royal Canadian Exercise Manual somewhere. Jackie, I'm not talking about touching your toes and waving your arms in the air 5 minutes a day. I'm serious. We should really do something. Like jogging. We can go over to Riverside Drive, run up to, say, 96th Street, then loop back on the promenade. I figure that's about 1.5 miles. Or we could run around the reservoir in Central Park. I'm beginning to be afraid you mean it. You're damned right. Jackie assessed Pete silently. This calls for a drink, she said, jumping up. Then she remembered the new jeans. Darling, she said, pirouetting in front of him. Don't you notice anything new and different around here? Oh, wow, said Pete delightedly. They're perfect. How could I have missed them? Jackie leaned down and gave him a long kiss. Be right back, she said, straightening up and heading toward the kitchen. Get me a drink too, will you, love? Pete called after her. She poured Pete a stolichnaya, then constructed a martini for herself. She and poor Sheldon Haber, hooked on that drink. Okay, she said, coming back into the living room. I think you're going overboard, but I'll make you a deal. I'll start jogging with you, but I want something in return. What? A new apartment. Oh, sure. Let's start the process again. It'll make this dump look good after we see the rents being asked for other dumps. Come on, show a little enthusiasm. You're like an old hound dog. As long as you know where to find your dish and a warm place to sleep, you're content. Don't forget stolichnayas and a nice round tush to bump against occasionally, he said, cupping her fanny appreciatively. I mean it, Pete. This place is getting to me. We were talking the other day about building some more bookcases. Where are we going to put them? In the elevator? And look at these walls. Gray. Besides, I've had it with the West Side. Where's your loyalty? My loyalty stops at Zabar's, and on off days it doesn't go that far. I want a place like Alan and Trish's. And I'd like to make $60,000 a year like Alan. Remember, I'm an editor, not a banker. I'm not saying we have to live on 70th and Park, but I'd sure like to give it a try. I capitulate. This weekend, it's apartment hunting. And jogging. You nut. I love you, she said, sliding toward Pete. She put her head in his lap and pulled him down toward her. They kissed, their tongues tingling from the booze. Now, said Pete, get up and get out of this gear. Jackie pulled her shirt and bra off, gently pinching her nipples. As she bent down to step out of her pants, he pressed his face against the small of her back and took a bite. I feel very kinky tonight, he said into her back. I wouldn't want you any other way. Chapter 2. Jackie knew what she wanted, which in real estate parlance was an apartment in a pre-war doorman building, spacious, bright, 4.5 rooms. They had decided they would not insist on high ceilings, a wood-burning fireplace, parquet floors, southern exposure, a view, or an eat-in kitchen, but that they must have a doorman, though not the kind decked out as a policeman. Light. Jackie had had it with dracaenas and philodendrons, and 2 bedrooms. Pete wanted a study. They ruled out new so-called luxury high-rises with their thin walls, cramped rooms, and lobbies filled with stained glass, fake stone grottos, chandeliers, and plastic palms. They decided to first look in the East 70s and 80s, and they set an upper limit on the rent of $800, which they both knew meant that they would go to $850 if sufficiently tempted. The next morning, Jackie canceled her lunch date with a rep from a 7th Avenue fabric house and, as soon as she had finished her Danish, began following up listings on the real estate pages of the Times. She set up dates to see 2 apartments that noon on the east side. At the first, a garden apartment, daylight barely penetrated 2 small windows at the front and a French door at the rear, before which a snarling German shepherd stood guard. She peered through the prison-like grillwork at the packed dirt beyond and retreated. For garden apartment, read basement with dog run. Apartment number 2 was a 6er, and as soon as she walked through the front door, Jackie understood why it was priced so reasonably. It was as if a crazed, small is beautiful advocate had been given his head. Walls made of plasterboard divided already minuscule rooms, giving the feeling of a laboratory maze. If you're not looking for something that's large and ostentatious, this could fill the bill, the agent said. On the next day, a Saturday, Jackie bought an early copy of the Sunday's Times and checked out a large and airy 4.5. The catch was that the 4.5 rooms faced rows of other people's rooms only yards away. In one of these rooms, Jackie saw a fat man in an undershirt, leisurely exploring his nose while reading the National Enquirer. She quickly turned away. She registered their names with the best 6 real estate agents in town and started spreading the word to friends. Sunday was anticlimactic because she already knew the real estate section by heart. However, she persuaded Pete to walk from block to block through the high 70s, canvassing supers and doormen. This proved to be a bust. The buildings they liked invariably were either co-ops or choice townhouses of the sort that had no turnover. After a few hours, they gave up and went to the new Stella show at the Whitney. In the weeks that followed, Jackie abandoned the absolute necessity of an East Side address. She flirted with the idea of Brooklyn Heights, but only briefly. No amount of double talk could make it pass for Manhattan. To keep from losing her sense of humor, she pinned a list of real estate hyperbole on her bulletin board. Ideal, magnificent, choice, fabulous, unique, unbelievable, charming, and for those under 4 feet tall, cozy. Pete was ready to meet her anywhere on a half-hour's notice, but she turned up no apartments worth this red alert urgency. The one positive development from that night of promises was that Pete had started jogging every day. Despite his verbal abuse, Jackie only occasionally ran with him. She had discovered that cigarettes and jogging didn't mix, and it was much easier to put up with Pete's self-righteous needling than give up smoking. Besides, she hated the boredom of running. One morning, minutes after Jackie arrived at her office, Pete called. "Larry's grandmother died," he said. "I'm sorry to hear that." "I'm sorry too, but that's not the point. Turn to Obits, page 33. Look at the address." "Oh, I see what you mean. Her apartment. But we can't call Larry up now." "I'm not saying we should call up Larry, dummy. Why don't you go by the building and see if the doorman will show the apartment to you? It's rent-controlled, and it's exactly where you want to be, East 68th Street. "You're a ghoul, and it's a great idea." The experience was humiliating. The doorman refused to acknowledge that there was an apartment available and referred her to the rental agent. When she telephoned the agent, he acted outraged. Who did Madame think she was? Didn't she realize there was a long waiting list for that apartment? He stopped just short of accusing her of knocking the old lady off. They had been apartment hunting now for 1 month, and the scorecard was a disaster. Apartments inspected, 21. Apartments screened over the telephone, 36. Real estate agents contacted and then vigorously pursued, 12. Apartments located, 0. At one real estate office, Jackie was asked to fill out a questionnaire that was more prying than a membership application for the racket club. Jackie told the real estate agent, a spry elderly woman in a jumpsuit, that she saw no reason to answer such personal questions. The old lady smiled at her patronizingly. She explained that they had a fabulous apartment in a very exclusive building, and the owners required more than the usual background on their prospective tenants. With a sigh, Jackie filled in the form. It took her almost 15 minutes, and she had to call Pete twice, once for the date he graduated from college, and then again for his blood type. "Why do you need our blood types?" Jackie asked the woman. "Accidents can happen. These people are very careful." 2 days later, the woman telephoned Jackie to say the apartment had been rented to somebody else. Soon after, she stopped checking the real estate listings and began to toy with the idea of covering the living room walls with fabric. Yes, she thought, admit it. You've given up. Chapter 3, April. At first, his mouth tasted of pennies. He'd read about that cliché plenty of times, but damn if it wasn't true. He took a swipe at his forehead, and a spray of perspiration flew off his fingers. His t-shirt clung to his back like wet newspaper. He could swear he tasted sweat socks now, joining but not eliminating the pennies. His legs were numb. They almost seemed disconnected from his body, except that they ached with a dull vengeance. His breath came in short, scratchy gasps. It was almost 7:30 in the morning, still cool. Pete was 3/4 through his first attempt to complete 1 lap of the 1.6-mile course that girdled the reservoir in Central Park. Just at the point when he had reached an almost sublime misery and was debating what part of his body hurt him the most, his chest, his legs, his feet, his left big toe. He had plastered a couple of Band-Aids onto a budding callus there, and now the Band-Aids were pulling and sticking. When he was prepared to quit at any moment, he heard someone overtaking him. He glanced to the left as a figure came into his field of vision. Gray hair. Then 2 more people, another man and a woman. They all looked solidly into their mid-50s. All 3 were dressed in matching powder blue jogging suits, and they moved in synchronized, effortless strides. Their heads were held high and they were smiling. Jesus Christ! They had passed him once before, just as he'd been starting out. The fires of hypochondria were quickly fueled. An image flashed before his eyes. Himself prostrate on the track. A cop bending over him, feeling his pulse. Nothing. The youngest cardiac of the year. Daily News centerfold material. Jackie in tears, dialing Frank Campbell's. As if to confirm his worst fears, he suddenly felt a savage stitch in his right side. He really must be in rotten shape. He would call Dr. Howard as soon as he got to the office and go in for a full checkup. He had meant to do that last month, but he had been so pleased with his running that he had let it slide. Now he could see that his progress was an illusion. This was the first time he had pushed himself, and it was a disaster. Finally, the end was in sight. Up ahead, the 3 middle-aged bluebirds were chatting animatedly. They looked cool and relaxed. With a rush of determination, Pete completed the lap and gratefully broke stride. His chest was heaving, and sweat washed down his face. He tugged off his jacket and threw it to the ground. His legs were rubbery, but he resisted the impulse to collapse and began to walk off his fatigue. He looked again at his watch. He had been running for 16 minutes. "Hey!" someone shouted. Pete turned just in time to see a thin black man with an overgrown copper-colored afro grab his jacket and, wheeling around in one smooth motion, sprint uphill toward a thick clump of bushes. To his amazement, the 2 men in powder blue took off after the thief, and before Pete could catch up, had recovered the jacket. The thief was gone. Pete puffed up to the men and, reaching for his jacket, thanked them. "Think nothing of it, young man," one of them said. "I'm glad we could help. This sort of thing happens too often, I'm afraid." He had thick gray hair cut in a trim crew cut and cheery blue eyes set off well by a ruddy tan. The other's hair was thinner, but if anything he looked healthier. "I hope nothing's missing," the man added. They both looked like airline pilots with a Fort Lauderdale run. "That's what I'm afraid of," said Pete, checking the second pocket. "Yep, he got my wallet. That means my credit cards and license. Hell, what a way to start the day." By now they had been joined by the woman. The man with the crew cut quickly explained the situation. "Can we help you?" asked the woman. "Do you want us to come to the police station with you as witnesses?" I think I could give them a very clear description of the man. "No, but thanks anyway. I'll report this, of course, though I doubt it'll do any good. What I've got to do right away is phone the credit card people. Oh, damn it!" Pete paused and ran his hands over his pants pockets. "My keys! He got those too! I've got to call my wife." "I'll tell you what," the crew cut began. Then, interrupting himself, he said, "By the way, I'm Arnold Jensen. This is my wife Phoebe and my neighbor, Victor McCrae. You're—" Pete introduced himself. As they were shaking hands, Jensen said, "We live right nearby, Mr. Lawrence. Come back to our place and make your telephone calls. It's the least we can do." When Pete protested, Phoebe Jensen spoke up for the first time. She was tall and elegant with lustrous gray hair. She must have been a beauty. She was handsome still, and her voice was surprisingly gentle for someone so commanding in appearance. "No, please, Mr. Lawrence, don't argue. We insist. Come." And so he did. He was angry, but not at himself. He took the kinds of normal precautions any sensible citizen of New York did, but who could figure the brazenness of that sneak thief? He had been only 20 feet from the jacket when the man grabbed it, and here he was with this improbable trio. Powder blue! Well, that color-coordinated business seemed ridiculous, but they were being as nice as they could be. They were really putting themselves out for him, and it would make things much easier. The next time anyone from out of town gave him any crap about the callousness of New Yorkers, he'd tell them about these people. Chapter 4. Jackie was the assistant buyer for less expensive dresses at Bendel's. The office she shared with Tyrone LeBlanc, the assistant buyer for accessories, was squirreled away on the 4th floor behind the boutique next to the ladies' room. It was just large enough for 2 desks, 3 chairs, and 1 filing cabinet, and its walls were dense with newspaper ads and pages torn from Women's Wear Daily, Vogue, and Bazaar. Jackie edged past Tyrone, who seemed to have succeeded in snaring a date with the man who was on the other end of the telephone. She dumped her purse onto her desk and sat down to sort through the collection of telephone messages on her spike. She had been out on 7th Avenue since early morning and was tired. Pete had called, and Trish, and a couple of manufacturers, one of whom she'd been avoiding, and a real estate agent about an apartment at 301 East 97th Street. Tyrone had scribbled, "She says you must see." That agent had a long wait in store for her. East 97th Street off 2nd Avenue, indeed. She heard Tyrone winding up his conversation and swiveled her chair around to say hello. "Hey, baby," he said. "You know, sometimes I think there might be something to being straight." Tyrone LeBlanc, née Theodore Carver White, was very black and wore a beautifully tailored, brilliant orange shirt, open at the neck, with a small white rosebud tucked into the top buttonhole of his wheat-colored linen jacket. "Tyrone, you've been having your lunch in the Ramble again. What happened? Strike out?" "Now, don't sass me, woman," he said, waving another pink slip in her direction. "I just 5 minutes ago took a delightful message from that beautiful hunk of a man you have. He said you're to meet him tonight at Le Grenouille at 7:30. "All right, Joker. You failed the audition. What did he say?" "I kid you not. That's what he said. And he also said, don't try to get back to him. He's tied up for the afternoon." He paused. Tied up. What a delicious idea. He gave a mock shiver and continued. "The frog pond'll set him back at least 100, if that is, you drink Ripple. You must be doing something right, baby." Chapter 5. Pete was already seated when Jackie was led into the restaurant. The maitre d' rolled officiously on ahead of her. Pete had chosen La Grenouille because Jackie, in star-struck moments, referred to it with awe. It was a favorite of all those people with names like Bunny and Swifty and Muffy, whose every move Women's Wear Daily chronicled faithfully. He didn't give a damn about the doings of that set, but they knew where to find some of the best French food in town. At a price, of course. It was a light and airy room filled with huge vases abrim with spring flowers. A smattering of tables were occupied by early diners. The maitre d' pulled back their table, and Jackie slipped down beside Pete on the banquette. She looked smashing in a slate-blue Calvin Klein blouse that looked as if it had been dyed to match her eyes. She was going to flip when he gave her the news. He still couldn't believe it himself. Jackie squeezed his hand and brushed his cheek with her lips. Then, before he could speak, she said, "All right, love, explain. Why are we here? Have you gone crazy, or did you just win first prize at the lottery?" "A little of both. A great thing happened to me today." "You fell and hit your head." "No, my wallet containing almost $100 and all my credit cards was stolen." "You're getting funnier by the second." "No, I mean it." "Oh, wait a minute. Here's a little something for us." A waiter approached their table carrying a bottle of champagne wedged firmly in a silver bucket. He reached over to a serving tray for 2 iced glasses, then held the bottle up, label side toward them. "Roederer Cristal, 1964. Perfect," said Pete. He nodded his approval, and the waiter filled their glasses. "To us," said Pete, checking the date on his watch, "and to April 17th. Then, starting at the beginning, he told her about the freaky thing that had happened to him in the park, and about how 2 of the runners in baby blue had asked him back to their apartment to make whatever calls he needed to. "I thought I'd get hold of you and you could bring the keys up so I could change." "Yes, Tyrone told me you called. Go on, go on." Pete paused for a moment and then laughed. Oh shit, I can't string this out any longer. I found it. Found what? What are you talking about? An apartment. The apartment. Jackie, this is it. You've got to be kidding. No, I mean it. Listen, after I tried to reach you and didn't, Arnold Jensen, that's one of the men who chased the guy who took my jacket, the other one's named Victor McRae, said not to worry. They'd lend me some taxi money to get home, and didn't our superintendent have a spare set of keys? We had a cup of tea, one of those herb teas, some kind of crazy mix of chamomile, sassafras, and God knows what else. Jensen called it Phoebe's Brew and teased his wife about it. Get on with it, Pete, Jackie implored. I can't stand it. Well, I was just about to leave when I said something about what a terrific place they had and how you would give your eye teeth to have an apartment like that. And this is what really gets me. I just happened to say that. What if I hadn't? And Phoebe asked right away, were we looking for an apartment? Because they had one available. Seems they own the building. With McRae and some of the other people who live there, I think. Jensen's an anthropologist. Still lectures occasionally at Columbia. McRae's a chemist, though I get the feeling he no longer works. Early retirement, I guess. Anyway, it seems they always rent a few of the apartments out. To young people, they said, because they like having them around. The couple in the apartment they had in mind had been transferred to Tacoma, and they were about to put it on the market. They asked me if I wanted to see it, and Jackie, it blew my mind. It's perfect. Oh my God, what's it like? Tell me. First, let me get the waiter. We need some more champagne. Pete signaled, and when their glasses were filled again, continued. It's a 4.5, I guess you'd call it. It's got a really large living room, L-shaped, with, dig this, a working fireplace set in a marvelous old carved marble mantelpiece. There are 2 terrific bay windows in the room, too. All the windows, by the way, have built-in shutters. The originals, it looked like, not new ones. There are 2 bedrooms. We can use the smaller one as a study. Hooray! The master bedroom has a fireplace, too. And yes, it works. It already has one whole wall of bookshelves. And the kitchen you won't believe. It must be at least 15 feet square, and it looks like they've recently redone it. Built-in dishwasher, butcher block counters, lots of working space, and a fabulous floor. Quarry tiles, polyurethaned, easy as hell to take care of. Stop! You're right. I don't believe it. Are you sure you're not making this whole thing up? There's more. The ceilings are probably 11 feet high, maybe higher. There are closets all over the place, and the whole thing looks over a great garden, southern exposure. I could go on, but you haven't heard anything yet. The rent's only $650. Come off it! Oh, I forgot one thing. Utilities are included. And even though you didn't ask, I'll tell you. The address is 12 East 83rd Street, which, in case you can't calculate fast enough, means it's between 5th and Madison. When can I see it? Jackie's face was flushed, and her voice was hoarse with excitement. Tonight, after dinner. They're having a party in the garden, and they asked us to come over and meet everybody. Oh, Pete! He leaned over and kissed her, then raised his glass again. To jogging, he said. And to sneak thieves, Jackie replied, touching her glass to Pete's.